The boy's lips barely moved at first. Just a tremor. A breath. In the 12th floor conference room, surrounded by framed awards and a skyline of Phoenix behind the glass, no one expected a sound. 9-year-old Eli stared at the man in the gray work shirt, his small hand pressed to his throat, the way that man had taught him. The CEO, the board, the doctors flown in from 3 different states all held their breath. The air conditioner hummed. A fluorescent light flickered. Then, like it hurt and healed at the same time, one broken word came out of the boy's mouth. Dad. Chairs scraped. Someone gasped. The man in the gray shirt, Luke Ramirez, the building's maintenance guy, closed his eyes for a second, as if he'd been punched. Eli's stepfather was frozen in place, tears already spilling down his face. The CEO, Eleanor Blake, looked from the child to the janitor, who'd been quietly fixing vents and door closers for 3 years, and whispered, "How did you do that?" Luke didn't answer. His hands were still shaking from the moment months earlier when he'd broken his own promise and stepped into a medical emergency he had sworn he'd never touch again. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. Now, to understand how a maintenance man ended up giving a silent boy his voice back in the middle of a corporate tower, you have to meet Luke Ramirez before anyone called him a hero. At 37, Luke's life was about as small and controlled as he could make it. He worked nights at Desert Horizon Plaza, a glass and steel office complex just off the freeway in Phoenix, Arizona. Most people assumed he was just the guy with the tool belt who changed filters and unclogged toilets. That was how he liked it. He drove an old blue pickup with more rust than paint. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment within walking distance of his son's middle school. Every evening he packed the same dinner leftover rice, grilled chicken and apple, and ate it in the empty loading dock between work orders. Routine was safe. Routine was quiet. No one there knew that 10 years earlier he'd worn a white coat instead of a gray shirt. Dr. Luke Ramirez, pediatric neurologist. The guy desperate parents begged to see when their child stopped talking or walking or making sense of the world. Back then, he'd lived in operating rooms and lab conferences, chasing new ways to help kids trapped inside their own heads. Then came the fire. A faulty generator during a summer blackout. Smoke, sirens, one terrible night that took his wife and baby girl and left him with burns on his hands, and a hospital full of people saying, "There was nothing you could have done." Luke never believed that. He walked away from medicine, from research, from the version of himself that made life and death calls. He took the first job where nobody cared about his resume, just whether the elevator doors closed right. The only thing he let himself care about was his son, Mateo, now 11. Mateo was the reason Luke got up, the reason he went to parent-teacher conferences with paint on his boots, the reason he kept the nightmares mostly to himself. Mateo loved comic books, cheap tacos, and tagging along on Luke's Saturday repair jobs. He also noticed things his dad tried hard to hide, like the way Luke flinched when he passed a children's hospital, or how he changed the channel whenever a medical drama came on. Across the plaza, on the top floors, lived a different world. Eleanor Blake, 61, ran Horizon Care Health from her corner office. To her employees, she was tough but fair. To shareholders, she was a shark. To the city, she was on billboards thanking our healthcare heroes. But to Eli, the quiet, dark-eyed boy who showed up sometimes clutching a sketchbook, she was just Nana. Eli hadn't spoken a word in 5 years. Doctors called it selective mutism at first, then trauma response, then a complex anxiety disorder. There had been a car accident when he was 4. His biological father hadn't made it. Eli had survived physically, but his voice never came back. Therapists, specialists, medication special schools, nothing changed it. Most people in the building knew the outline of the story. They lowered their voices when Eleanor walked by with the boy. They pitied him, admired her, and moved on. Mateo didn't move on. The first time he saw Eli waiting in the lobby, he walked over and sat next to him, like it was the most normal thing in the world talking about superheroes, while Eli drew wordless cityscapes on his pad. From then on, whenever Luke covered a daytime shift or an emergency call, Mateo tried to time it so he might run into that quiet kid with the cool drawings. Luke watched all this from a distance, something tight in his chest. The old instincts he'd buried twitched every time he saw Eli's hands tremble just slightly when the lobby got loud, or the way the boy tracked exits with his eyes. He told himself it wasn't his business. These people had the best doctors money could buy. Then, on a blistering Thursday afternoon in July, the building's fire alarm system was scheduled for a full-volume test. 10 seconds of blaring sirens, flashing strobe lights, just another item on Luke's work order list. He checked the panels, called security, gave the all-clear. What he didn't know, what nobody bothered to check, was that Eleanor's grandson was upstairs that day, sitting in a glass-walled conference room while executives walked through quarterly numbers. The first wail of the siren hit like a hammer. Red strobes exploded against the walls. People laughed, annoyed but unconcerned. Only one person in the building went rigid at the sound: Eli. From the maintenance hallway, Luke heard the alarm, heard the muffled shouts, and then under all of it a pattern in the boy's breathing that froze him in place, hyperventilating, gasping between silent, panicked sobs. And something else, a faint, rapid beeping he recognized from another life. He dropped his clipboard. He was already moving toward the conference floor before he even realized he'd made a choice. Luke reached the glass conference floor just as the fire alarm shut off, leaving behind a thick, trembling silence. Executives spilled out of rooms like irritated cattle brushing ash from their sleeves, even though there was no fire, no smoke, nothing except the aftertaste of chaos. Maintenance triggered it early, one man muttered to another. Figures. Luke ignored the jab and scanned the hall. No sign of Eli. No sign of Eleanor either. But that faint, rapid beeping he'd heard too tight, too fast, too familiar, still pulsed somewhere behind the double doors of Conference 12B. He pushed through. Inside chairs were overturned. A pitcher of water lay shattered on the carpet, papers scattered like feathers. And under the far end of the table, where the light hit in a trembling, cold blue angle, a small boy curled into himself, hands clamped to his ears, breaths coming too quick to be safe. Eleanor Blake knelt beside him, pale, rattled, whispering his name with a mix of fear and helplessness that punched straight into Luke's chest. He crouched down without asking. "Ma'am, let me try." Eleanor's head snapped toward him. You're the maintenance tech. You can't." But she saw the look in his eyes. Something in it quieted her argument. She moved back, and Luke, with hands still bearing faint scars from a fire 10 years gone, touched 2 fingers gently to the boy's wrist. Counting, feeling, listening in the silence the way he used to listen in emergency rooms. The beeping wasn't a device, it was the boy's breath. A stuttered, panicked rhythm Luke had once been trained to recognize instantly. He guided Eli out from under the table, slow and grounding, counting breaths, creating rhythm with his own chest so the child's could follow. And little by little, the boy's trembling eased, his eyes huge and wet, fixed on Luke, the way a drowning swimmer locks onto a hand reaching from the shore. 10 minutes later, Eli was stable. Eleanor was shaken but composed. Executives were returning to business as usual. And Luke? He walked back to the maintenance corridor, praying no one had seen the way his hands had wanted to keep checking, keep comforting old instincts clawing to the surface. He couldn't let that happen again. He had limits now. He had to. But the building had other plans. By the next morning, rumors had spread. Someone claimed they saw the maintenance guy kneeling next to the CEO's grandson interfering with company matters. Others said he'd overstepped during a safety test. A few argued he'd caused unnecessary panic by barging into a meeting. Luke heard it all over the radios as he checked fuse boxes. One voice crackled through loud and clear. Sandra, the building's head of operations. I don't care how capable he thinks he is. This isn't a clinic. He needs to stay in his lane. Another voice chimed in. The kid had an episode because the alarm freaked him out. Doesn't mean the maintenance guy gets to play hero. Luke closed his eyes, exhaled through his nose, and set down his tools. He had expected this. Hoped he could avoid it. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want the past clawing open. But by noon, things were worse. Sandra cornered him near the freight elevator, lips tight, clipboard tucked against her ribs like she was ready to weaponize it. I've received 3 complaints, she said. Luke stamped his hands on a rag. About what? About you inserting yourself where you don't belong. He blinked. A kid was in trouble. The alarm, you are not medical staff. You are not crisis trained. And you certainly are not authorized to interact with family members of the executive board. The sting wasn't her words. It was the implication that helping a frightened child was somehow an offense. I didn't do anything inappropriate, he said quietly. That's not the point. The point is chain of command. Your maintenance. Stick to maintenance. Leave the rest to people qualified for it. Qualified. That word hit the old wound's dead center. He swallowed hard. Understood. She walked off without another glance. Luke stood there feeling the old shame stir. That familiar whisper. You don't belong. Keep your head down. Don't get attached. He almost believed it again. Until the freight elevator doors slid open and his son stepped out. Dad, Matteo, looked up at him, backpack slung over one shoulder. You okay? Luke forced a smile. Why are you here? School ended early. Mrs. Donnelly had car trouble. Said I could walk over instead of waiting. Luke nodded. All right. Sit tight in the office while I finish this hallway. Matteo shrugged, but Luke recognized the concern in his eyes. The kid noticed everything. Always had. He sat on an overturned bucket while his father cleaned a vent grate. They didn't talk for a minute. Then Matteo said quietly, People were talking about you in the lobby. Luke paused. What did you hear, that you overstepped with that kid yesterday? Luke's jaw tightened. It's complicated. Matteo kicked a pebble across the floor. I saw him once, that kid. He looked scared of everything. Why'd they get mad at you for helping? Luke didn't answer. He didn't know how to not without opening a door he had worked for a decade to keep locked shut. Matteo stared at him for another long second before sighing. I hate when people talk about you like they know you. The words hit harder than anything Sandra had said. Luke put a hand on his son's shoulder. It's all right, bud. I'm fine. But he wasn't. Not really. Because as they walked down the corridor, 2 junior executives stepped out of the break room. They stopped speaking the moment they saw Luke. One raised her eyebrows, whispering something behind her hand. The other gave a small smirk. Matteo saw it. He saw everything. His cheeks reddened. Why do they look at you like that? Luke kept walking. Keep your head up. Matteo did chin-high eyes burning with the kind of hurt only children feel on behalf of the one person in the world who protects them. Luke wished he could shield him from that, take the impact himself. But the truth was, the resentment wasn't new. People always looked down on the maintenance crew. It came with the job. But this time, because of yesterday, it felt sharper, more personal. And it wasn't over. By late afternoon, Eleanor's assistant called down to the maintenance office. "Ms. Blake wants to speak to you. Conference room 6A, right now." Luke hesitated. Meetings with executives weren't in his job description, especially not after the morning he'd had. He left Matteo reading comics in the office and took the elevator up. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. When he entered the room, he realized why. It wasn't just Eleanor. It was Sandra. 2 board members, and a security supervisor. His stomach dropped. "Mr. Ramirez." Sandra said, arms crossed. "We're reviewing yesterday's incident." Eleanor looked torn, somewhere between gratitude and corporate caution. "Luke, I appreciate what you did for my grandson, truly. But the board has concerns." One of the men leaned back in his chair. "Your behavior created liability issues. You're not trained for crisis response. You're not cleared to interact with family members. And according to our policies, I didn't break policy," Luke said softly. "I helped a child who was scared." The man smirked. "That's not your role." Luke's hands tightened around the brim of his cap. His heartbeat drummed in his ears. Eleanor spoke again, quieter this time. "No one is questioning your intentions. But for the sake of clarity and safety, we need to determine whether your actions complicate your employment here." There it was. A door opening on the same old nightmare, being blamed for stepping in, blamed for caring, blamed for having instincts he wished he didn't still have. He stood still, absorbing the weight of the eyes on him. Eyes that saw a maintenance man stepping out of line. A nobody meddling in matters too big for him. And worse, eyes that saw his past creeping out from the shadows he'd buried it in. He forced his breath steady. "Are you firing me?" Sandra answered before anyone else could. "We are considering disciplinary action." Eleanor closed her eyes for half a heartbeat, like she hated the phrase herself. Luke nodded once, jaw clenched so tight it ached. He wasn't angry, not in the explosive way he used to be. This was a different kind of hurt. Quiet. Bone deep. "Understood," he said. "If that's the decision, just tell me." "We haven't made a decision yet," Eleanor said. "We just need time." Time. As if his life weren't built around holding it together minute by minute. He turned to leave. But when he opened the door, Matteo stood there. He'd slipped out of the office, followed him, because he knew something was wrong. The boy's face crumpled when he saw the room full of suits. The look on his father's face, the tension so thick it was almost visible. "Dad, are they firing you?" Silence. A heavy, breathless silence. Luke swallowed. "Go wait downstairs, buddy." Matteo didn't move. His voice cracked. "But you didn't do anything wrong." One of the board members muttered, "This is why employees shouldn't bring their kids." Luke turned. "Don't." The man went silent. But the damage was done. Matteo's eyes filled. Not because of the scolding, but because he heard, truly heard, the tone, the disrespect that adults thought kids couldn't catch. Luke put a hand on his son's shoulder and walked him back to the elevator. When the doors closed, he saw Matteo wipe his cheeks with the back of his sleeve. And that did it. That cracked something open inside him he'd been holding shut for years. Not anger. Resolve. A pressure rising so strong it made the air feel tight. Something big was coming. something he wasn't sure he could stop this time. The next morning, Phoenix broke with a wall of heat that shimmered off the sidewalks and turned the glass towers along East Osborne Road into blinding mirrors. Luke woke early, long before Mateo stirred, because he couldn't shake the tightness in his chest. The meeting. The looks. The way Mateo's voice cracked when he asked if they were firing him. He used to be good at pushing that stuff down, at letting the world slide past him, but now it sat on him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. He drove to work in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Every breath tasted like old hospitals, old failures. And something in him, some instinct he thought he'd buried, kept whispering, "It isn't over. Something's coming." By 9 a.m., the temperature had already hit triple digits. Horizon Care's air conditioning system strained, humming loud enough for Luke to hear it through the maintenance ducts. He checked pressure gauges, coolant lines, fan belts. All normal. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet he felt it the way animals feel storms before they hit. He could sense tension in the building's bones. He was repairing a cracked tile near the children's waiting area when he heard raised voices from down the hall. At first, he ignored it. Arguments between executives weren't his business. But then, a sound cut through the hall so sharply it pulled him to his feet. Not a scream. Not exactly. More like a strangled gasp. A sound someone makes when they're trying not to scream. Eli. Luke didn't know how he knew, but he knew. He dropped his tools and ran. Outside conference room, 3C people gathered in a confused cluster. Some pressed close to the glass, others backed away as if afraid to get involved. Inside, Eleanor Blake was kneeling on the carpet again. Only this time it wasn't a fire alarm causing the panic. The overhead lights flickered wildly, strobing bright white flashes that reflected off the chrome accents and glass walls. The room's temperature had climbed at least 20 degrees higher near the ceiling, like a heat pocket pushing down. Eli sat against the wall, knees to his chest, breath shallow and fast. Sweat darkened his hairline. His face was ghost pale. Luke scanned the ceiling immediately. The HVAC vent above the boy rattled violently, metal clanging in uneven bursts. Something was wrong with the cooling line. Very wrong. He shoved through the cluster of employees. "Move," he ordered. Not loud, but firm enough that people parted. Eleanor didn't look up. "It's happening again," she whispered. "But worse. I tried calling the nurse, she's on her way, but he's overheating. The lights, something's wrong." Luke stepped into the room, already feeling the thick, suffocating heat. He'd felt heat like this once before in a burning neonatal wing 10 years ago. His pulse kicked hard in his throat. His vision tunneled. He forced it back. He needed to stay here. In this room, with this child. He moved to the HVAC panel in 3 strides. The sound coming from inside was unmistakable line pressure, failing compressor, overheating coolant pump, choking on debris. If the pressure valve blew, the coolant could rupture. Not explosive, but enough to blast scalding steam across the room. "Get him away from the vent," Luke said. Eleanor tried, but the boy couldn't move. His muscles were locked in panic. Luke crouched beside him. The air from the vent was scorching now, like someone had set a heat gun above them. The flickering lights made the shadows jump, turning the room into something out of a nightmare. Executives stood frozen, useless. Luke touched Eli's wrist, same place he'd checked the day of the fire alarm. The pulse was a drumbeat of terror. He needed to get the boy out. But if he moved him wrong, if the vent blew at that moment, a memory slammed into him, without mercy, smoke. Baby-sized hospital cribs. His wife's last words telling him there were still children inside the wing. He had sworn he would never be in a room like that again. Never face something he couldn't fix. But this wasn't a burning wing. This was one child. One terrified child. And Luke wasn't going to lose another one. "Eli," he said, voice steady, "look at me." The boy's wide, frantic eyes slowly shifted to him. Luke lifted the child into his arms. Eli clung to him instantly, face pressed into Luke's shoulder breath, shaking against his neck. "Everyone out," Luke said. "Now." People obeyed. Even the board members. Even Sandra. Eleanor stayed. "Go," he told her. "I'll get him out." Something in his tone, something absolute, made her step aside. Luke carried the boy toward the door, but halfway across the room, the vent made a sound that froze them both. A high-pitched metallic shriek. Pressure valve giving. He spun on instinct, shielding the child with his body. The vent erupted, spraying a blast of boiling air and hot mist. Pain tore across Luke's back and shoulder in a wave of fire-hot needles. He held Eli tighter. The room filled with scalding humidity. Lights flickered off. Silence swallowed everything. When the emergency lights finally kicked on, Luke was on his knees, still wrapped around Eli, shielding him completely. The boy trembled, but he was breathing. Breathing in steady counts against Luke's chest. Luke didn't move. Not until he was sure. Eleanor rushed in the second the backup lights stabilized. She froze at the sight, Luke clutching her grandson's steam still drifting from the cracked vent above them. "Is he hurt?" she gasped. Luke shook his head. Not a scratch on him. His own shirt was scorched along the back. The skin underneath burned raw. Pain bit hard, but he pushed it down. He gently lowered Eli to the carpet, keeping a hand on his shoulder until the boy slowly uncurled his fingers from Luke's shirt. Only then did Luke stand. Sandra stormed into the room, next voice sharp. "What the hell happened? And why were you even—" She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes swept from the ruined vent to the steam, to Luke's blistered shoulders, and finally to the small boy who reached with trembling fingers for Luke's hand. Eli wasn't panicked anymore. He wasn't curled up. He wasn't shutting down. He pressed his palm against Luke's chest, right over his heartbeat, and breathed with him. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Luke knelt again, meeting the boy's eyes. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're safe." Eli's throat worked. His lips moved, trying to shape something, anything. A sound slipped out. Barely there, broken but real. A soft, trembling Lou. Not a full name. Not even a full syllable. But a sound born from courage and proximity and trust. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Sandra's clipboard dropped to the floor. Two executives near the doorway leaned forward in shock. Luke froze, not because it frightened him, but because it cracked something open inside him he'd welded shut for a decade. He saw a child rediscovering the first hint of voice. He saw a chance he thought he'd never earn again. He saw healing, maybe for both of them. Eleanor knelt beside them, tears streaking her makeup. He hasn't tried to, not since the accident. Luke touched the boy's shoulder gently. He's trying now. The room shifted on its axis. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. The man they had dismissed, the man they almost fired, the man they thought was just a janitor, had walked straight into danger and protected a child with instinct and knowledge they never knew he had. A power dynamic shattered in that moment. A hierarchy collapsed. Respect, difficult, heavy, overdue, settled into the air like dust after a storm. Sandra swallowed hard. "Ramirez, we need to talk." But Eleanor cut her off sharply. "No, I need to talk to him." She rose, turned to the stunned room of executives and said, "Everyone out. Now." Her voice left no room for argument. As people filed away, glancing back at Luke, with new eyes, with shame, with awe, Luke stayed where he was on the carpet, one hand steady on Eli's shoulder. The boy leaned close, resting his forehead against Luke's arm. Luke closed his eyes and let out a long, trembling breath he'd been holding for 10 years. The crisis wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But something irreversible had just happened. And the truth, his truth, was about to blow the entire building wide open. The building felt too quiet after the chaos. Emergency lights still pulsed a faint red, as if the walls remembered everything that had just happened. The scorched vent above Conference Room 3C hissed its final breaths. Steam thinned into the air like a ghost leaving the room. Luke stayed kneeling beside Eli until the boy's trembling faded. Eleanor Blake stood a few feet away, one hand pressed against her mouth, the other gripping the back of a chair for balance. The rest of the staff had been sent out, but their muffled whispers drifted through the hall, fear, astonishment, confusion, all mixed into a low hum. No one dared step inside again. Luke shifted carefully the burn across his back, pulling like skin made of cracked glass. He ignored it. The only thing that mattered was the small boy gripping his sleeve with both hands. Eli's breathing steadied against his arm. His forehead rested on Luke's shoulder, as if he'd been doing that all his life. "What you did," Eleanor finally said, voice thin. No one else even thought to Luke. You moved like you knew exactly what was happening. He didn't answer. He couldn't yet, because part of him was still standing in an old hospital wing, smoke stinging his eyes, cradling a baby, while the world burned around him. He forced the memory down. A security supervisor appeared in the doorway, sweating through his uniform. "Ma'am, EMTs are on the way." Eleanor didn't look at him. "Tell them to wait outside until I say otherwise." "But now!" The guard stepped back instantly. The power in her voice was unmistakable, but something else had changed too. She wasn't addressing Luke like a liability anymore. She looked at him like someone looking at a man she completely misjudged. When she stepped closer, her voice softened. "He said your name." She swallowed hard. He tried to say it. Luke stared at the boy's small hand wrapped around his fingers. "I know." Eleanor wiped tears she didn't realize she'd been shedding. "How did you get through to him?" "He hasn't attempted anything like that in 5 years. Not once." He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to open doors he'd welded shut for a decade. But he could see it, the question burning inside her, the desperate need to understand how her grandson had just crossed a line no doctor, therapist, or specialist ever got him near. "I should tell you something," Luke said quietly. But before he could continue, Sandra appeared at the doorway again, stiff posture clipboard under her arm like a shield. But this time she didn't carry her usual cold certainty. She looked from the cracked vent to Luke's burned shirt, to the boy who was still clinging to him. Her voice faltered. "Ramirez, I didn't know the system was failing like that. The heat spike was. I never would have." "You didn't know," Luke said calmly. She blinked. She expected anger, expected defensiveness. She didn't expect calm. Eleanor crossed her arms, voice sharp. "He saved my grandson's life." Sandra nodded, small and embarrassed. Yes. Yes, he did." A silence stretched between them. Not hostile heavy. Eleanor turned back to Luke. "You were going to tell me something." He nodded. "But not here. Not with half the building listening." Sandra stepped aside when he stood wincing as his muscles pulled. Eleanor helped support his arm, not because he asked, but because she couldn't not. Eli refused to release Luke's sleeve, so the three of them walked together down the hallway, while employees parted like water around a bow. Luke could feel the shift with every step. This wasn't the walk of a maintenance tech following orders. This was the walk of a man people were afraid to look away from. Eleanor led them into a medical evaluation room, quiet, cool, dimly lit. The building nurse hovered nearby with a first aid kit, but Eleanor raised a hand. Not yet. Close the door. The nurse obeyed. They were alone. Luke sat carefully on the padded bench, EII tucked close at his side. Eleanor took the chair opposite. "Tell me the truth," she said softly, "because I think I've been seeing only a fraction of who you are." Luke looked down at his hands with faint old scars and fresh reddening burns. "My name is Luke Ramirez," he said, "but you already know that." Eleanor nodded. "What you don't know is what I was before this job." He waited for the panic to rise inside him, the resistance, the instinct to shut down and walk away. But instead he felt a strange stillness. As if the moment he shielded Eli from the vent, the dam he'd built inside himself had already cracked. "I wasn't always in maintenance," he continued. 10 years ago, I was a pediatric neurologist. I specialized in developmental trauma sensory disorders and neural response patterns." The words hung there suspended in the quiet room. Eleanor stared at him. Sandra, who had slipped in quietly and stood near the door, froze with her clipboard halfway lowered. Luke kept going. "I worked in children's hospitals for years. I studied the ways the brain rewires itself after shock, after grief, after sudden loss. And I spent most of my 30s trying to help kids who had shut down because the world was too loud for them." He paused. "My daughter died in a fire. My wife tried to save her. After that, I couldn't walk into a hospital again, couldn't make decisions that meant life or death." He lifted his eyes. "So I picked the first job where nobody expected anything from me. A quiet job. A small job. One where I wouldn't have to use my mind for anything except fixing things made of metal." Eleanor's breath shook. "And then you found my grandson." Luke nodded. "And the first time I saw him during the fire alarm, the way he curled, the way his breathing dropped into a panic rhythm, I recognized the pattern. It's something I was trained to catch instantly." Sandra sat down slowly, the truth settling on her like weight. "So when the vent malfunctioned today, I could hear what was happening," Luke said. "And I could see the danger before anyone else did." "No," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "You didn't just see it. You ran toward it." Luke didn't answer because it wasn't something he could explain. When he saw Eli on the floor, when he heard the vent screaming toward failure, it wasn't about bravery. It was about a promise whispered beside a hospital bed years ago, his wife's hand in his. Her voice breaking as she said, "Luke, don't stop saving them." He never intended to keep that promise. Until now. Eleanor clasped her hands together as though to stop them from shaking. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you used to be?" Luke shook his head. "Because I didn't want to be that person anymore. Because I failed once. And because I didn't think I'd ever trust myself again." Eli pressed closer, small fingers curling around Luke's arm. Eleanor watched the gesture with a trembling exhale. "My grandson trusts you more than anyone I've ever hired. More than me sometimes." "That's not true," Luke said quietly. "It is." Her voice softened. "He reached for you while the building was falling apart. He tried to speak because of you. Sandra spoke for the first time, voice hushed. We were so wrong about you." Luke didn't respond. He didn't need her apology. The shift in her tone already said everything. Eleanor leaned forward. "I want you to come back to medicine," she said. "Not hospitals, not trauma centers, but here. We have entire floors of research teams who would give anything to learn from you. Nobody on this staff understands developmental shutdown like you do. Nobody sees what you see." Luke blinked. "Eleanor, I'm creating a position for you," she continued, determination hardening her grief-softened expression. "Director of Pediatric Neural Recovery. You'd have a team, a lab, resources, freedom." He stiffened. "I don't want—" "It's not about what you want," she said gently. "It's about what you're meant to do." Eli tugged on Luke's sleeve as if echoing the sentiment. Sandra swallowed hard, clearing her throat. "If you'd take the job, I'll personally issue a formal statement clearing your name. And I'll address the staff. Everyone will know what you did today." Luke shook his head sharply. "I don't want recognition." Eleanor's voice warmed. "Then do it for him." She nodded toward the boy leaning against Luke's side. "He needs someone who understands him. Really understands him. And I don't think—" Her voice wavered. "I don't think that person is a therapist or a specialist. I think it's you." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting. Luke looked at the child whose heartbeat he'd steadied, whose panic he'd eased, whose voice had cracked open for the first time in half a decade in a conference room full of doubters. And he thought of his daughter, her laughter, her tiny fingers curled around his thumb. The life he lost, the life he never thought he'd serve again. He found himself breathing deeper, softer, stronger. "I'll consider it," he whispered. Eleanor nodded relief, softening her posture. "That's all I ask." But the moment didn't end there, because Eli lifted his face, leaned close to Luke's ear, and breathed one syllable. "Lou," trying again, pushing the edges of silence, reaching through fear to find connection. Eleanor gasped. Sandra covered her mouth. The nurse froze in the doorway. Luke closed his eyes, the sound hitting him harder than the heat, harder than the pain, harder than anything in years. A child's first attempt at reclaiming his voice, and he'd made it for him. Everything in the room shifted. The hierarchy collapsed. The assumptions crumbled. The roles reversed. Luke Ramirez, once invisible, was now the one everyone looked to. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of awe. And somewhere deep inside him a door unlocked, flooding him with the same fear and hope that always lived hand in hand inside people who had once lost everything. He didn't know what path lay ahead, but he knew this. He wasn't done saving children, and this time he wasn't going to run from that truth. The shift inside Horizon Care happened faster than anyone expected. Word of what had happened in Conference Room 3C spread through the building before the emergency lights even shut off. By afternoon, people who once walked past Luke without a glance were stopping him in the hall, offering quiet thanks, stunned nods, or simply a look that said they understood now, understood who he was, what he carried, and what he had done. Sandra approached him first. Not with a clipboard, not with a reprimand, just a woman humbled by her own misjudgment. She apologized without excuses. Eyes lowered, voice unsteady. "I should have seen you," she said. "I should have seen what you were doing, who you really were." Luke didn't need the apology, but he accepted it, because letting it in felt like putting down something heavy he'd been carrying too long. The board's tone changed overnight. No more half-hidden threats, No more warnings about staying in his lane. Instead, they asked how long the HVAC system had been declining without their noticing, how he knew the vent was near failure when no alarms had triggered, how he'd recognized the panic rhythm in Eli's breathing. By the next morning, they were all calling him Dr. Ramirez, a name he never thought he'd hear again. But none of that mattered compared to the moment that came later that same week when Mateo found him packing up old maintenance tools into a cardboard box. The boy's eyes widened. "Dad, you're not getting fired, right?" Luke smiled. Not the tired, practiced smile he'd worn for years, but a real one. "No, buddy. I'm starting something new." Mateo's shoulders loosened instantly. Relief washed through him. He stepped closer, touching the burn ointment along his father's shoulder. "Does it hurt?" Luke pulled him into a half-hug. "Not as much as it used to." The transition didn't happen in a day. Luke spent 2 weeks shadowing Horizon Care's therapy teams, reacquainting himself with research journals he once devoured, learning what had changed in the decade he'd been gone. Some of it overwhelmed him, the new tech, the new language, the new protocols. But a familiar spark, one he thought had gone out forever, flickered back to life. He noticed small things the others missed. How certain children reacted when footsteps echoed too loudly in the hallway. How a subtle change in room temperature altered a kid's posture. How tones, rhythms, and pressure patterns shaped the way the brain calmed or shut down. It wasn't just skill, it wasn't memory. It was something like coming home to a version of himself he'd buried under grief and guilt, thinking that losing it was safer than trying again. And through it all, Eli stayed close. The boy would tap gently on Luke's arm when he wanted him to follow, press his palm against Luke's chest to steady his own breathing, sit beside him in sessions sketching little shapes and patterns that looked suspiciously like waves, sound waves, maybe even if Eli didn't yet realize it. Day by day, the syllables grew stronger. Luke never pushed. He never asked. He simply built a place where sound didn't have to be loud to matter. Eleanor saw all of it. Sometimes from the observation window, sometimes from the doorway with her arms crossed and eyes shining in a way she didn't try to hide anymore. The fierce, steel-hard CEO softened around the edges, as if someone had taken years of pressure off her shoulders. She thanked Luke often, not for what he did in the conference room, but for the way her grandson looked at the world differently now. Less fear, more curiosity. And Luke in those moments realized something quietly astonishing. His healing was tied to Eli's. Each step forward the boy made nudged something loose inside him too. 3 months later, Horizon Care unveiled the Pediatric Neural Recovery Program. Not in a flashy press event, not the Eleanor Blake way. Instead, they held a small gathering under the courtyard awning where the desert breeze cut the heat just enough. The staff stood by not as skeptics, but as believers. Eleanor introduced Luke personally, not with corporate polish, but with gratitude that trembled in her voice. She spoke of courage in a conference room, a child reaching beyond silence, and a man who walked back into the fire because his heart wouldn't let him walk away again. When she stepped aside, Eli moved forward on his own. The courtyard went still. He touched his throat, then Luke's sleeve, and shaped a word that came out soft, breathy, but clear enough to echo in every listening heart. Thank you. 2 syllables, 7 letters, a miracle wrapped in breath. Luke knelt so they were eye level. Eli leaned forward and rested his forehead against Luke's. No more tremors, no fear, just certainty. Mateo from the crowd shouted, "That's my dad," in a voice he didn't bother trying to hide. Laughter rippled through the courtyard. For the first time in a long time, Luke didn't feel like he was standing with one foot in the past and one in the future. He felt present, whole, exactly where he was meant to be. A year later, things looked different at Horizon Care. The sensory hallways Luke designed were now standard across 3 sites. Therapy rooms used light vibration and touch to help children rediscover sound at their own pace. Parents came from across the state seeking help. Some cried in gratitude. Some brought homemade tamales or drawings or letters from kids who'd found courage they didn't know they had. Eleanor visited often never as a CEO checking on progress, but as a grandmother watching her grandson flourish. She smiled more now. The staff noticed. So did the shareholders. Sandra became one of Luke's strongest allies. Humility has a way of reshaping a person's values. She asked questions now instead of issuing orders. She listened. She learned. But the biggest change by far was Eli. The boy who once sat curled in corners now ran through the courtyard laughing with Mateo. His words were still soft, his sentences short, but the progress was undeniable. Every new sound was a victory. Every day was a step away from fear and toward possibility. Luke spent weekends with him and Eleanor, sometimes fixing leaky faucets in her house, sometimes watching old movies with the kids sprawled on the rug between them. It wasn't traditional, it wasn't planned, but it felt like something growing roots. Sometimes late at night, Luke would find a quiet moment in his office lights low, the building humming around him. He'd place a hand on his left shoulder where the burn scars had faded into pale marks. They didn't hurt now. They reminded him. Life doesn't end when something breaks. Sometimes that's when it starts reshaping. And as he watched Eli and Mateo chase each other between the courtyard's orange trees on that 1-year anniversary, sunlight splashing across the pavement, he felt something he hadn't felt in more than a decade. Peace. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the future finally had room to breathe. Some stories remind us that heroes don't always wear uniforms or badges. Sometimes they're the ones who pick up the tools everyone else overlooks and use them to fix things no one else even sees. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is let themselves start again.